Hello and good morning, everyone. Only Positivity here. I have my coffee with me, ready to kick off podcast number 21 on this playlist that I'm looking to launch called Elevated Thoughts. So, before diving into the new book for today, let's just start with a level set. So, as I endeavor upon pursuing knowledge and life experience in this next phase of life through fitness, photography, traveling, and many other things, one habit that I've really formed is reading. So this podcast essentially goes through some of the books I've been reading as of late, taking those lessons learned and applying them to experiences in my life. So before diving into the book, let's go ahead and start with today's story. So, um, I don't know if this story is funny or not, but just an interesting experience. Okay, so when I was back in undergrad, I spent a lot of time interning at firms downtown, which was easy for me because I went to school downtown. So I would always have a job in college, and so at this one particular financial firm, I interned at for quite some time. Um, we had a Christmas party, right? Every year in December at some time, we would have a Christmas party. Now, I was not really a big person who would drink before I was 21. Not that I was holier than thou or anything like that. I just never, really took, right? I didn't really start drinking until after I was 21. So, essentially, at this Christmas party, I'll tell you how big of a noob I was, right? I ordered a Shirley Temple, which I still think is a really good drink. So I ordered a Shirley Temple, and also our Christmas party was at Trump Tower, downtown Chicago, right? So, all issues with Trump aside, the Trump Tower in Chicago is a dope ass spot. It's one of the nicest places in downtown Chicago, really bougie, nice ballrooms, nice hotel, right? So it's really upscale to be doing a Christmas party there, right? So we're there, we're having a good time. I'm with my team. I'm an intern, so I'm not even I'm 21 at this point, and everyone else is at least 30, right? So I'm the youngest one there, and I was still really cautious about drinking in front of my coworkers. So my 21st birthday was a couple months back, and we hadn't celebrated, so we were actually going to celebrate that night because it was a night that all my boys were free, and we were just gonna go out when I got back from this Christmas party, which wasn't gonna be too late, right? It started at like 6:30. I was heading out around 9, right? So um, I'm heading out, right? It's 9:30, and everyone else is starting to head out too, right? Wrapping up for the evening because a lot of people come from the burbs and things like that, so they got to catch the CTA or the Metra back home. So during my time with this firm, I had a controller, right? So the controller at this particular firm reported up to the vice president, right? So he was pretty high up there, and he was a real like stoic little guy, kind of sarcastic, almost he was kind of a dick, to be honest. And he had a wife and two kids, right? He had the full family, the nuclear family unit. So we're leaving, and this guy never talks to me, right, at work, even though he's my coworker's boss. So he never talks to me, but I'm leaving, and I think, we were kind of hitting off at the party, and he goes, "Where are you going now?" And I go, "Hey man, I'm going out for the night. I'm gonna, hop on the red line, go back to Wrigley where I was living, and me and the guys are gonna go out." And he goes, "Can I come with?" And I go, "Yeah, sure, why not, man? Like I'm all about like, hanging out with people, and things like that, and getting to know them outside of work. So, why not? Come along, man." So, mind you, this guy's probably 40 years old. So, all good. So we get on the red line. We go back to Wrigley. We go to my apartment and we pregame a little bit, right? So we're hanging out. My guys are pretty cool about it. So we're hanging out. He's fine. We're good. So then we go to the bars, right? We live in Wrigleyville. My buddies live in Wrigleyville. So we all just congregate at my place, go out for the night. So we go out for the night, we're celebrating, having a great time, right? And it's about, right, the bars in Wrigley close between 1 and 3 a.m., right? So it's about 2 a.m. and we're ready to go, right? We're not necessarily going to go to sleep at this point, but we're just probably going to go back, play some video games or something, chill and wind the night down, right? And we all live literally right next door to each other, so we can all just kind of hang out at my place, and then they can either pass out for a little bit, wake up, go to their place, since it's right next door. So we're leaving, and I'm assuming at this point my controller is gonna want to go back to his home, right, in the suburbs with his family, and figure that out, right? It's like 2 a.m. So we're leaving, and then he goes, "What are you guys doing now?" And I go, "Nothing, man. We're just gonna go back, like just chill for a little bit, maybe knock out after, a little bit." So he's like, "Can I come?" I go, "All right, yeah, definitely, man. Come on down." So he comes over, again. And, there's still a lot of people there. All the guys are there. Um, so then we're chilling for another hour, playing video games, playing FIFA and stuff like that. And after an hour and a half, he leaves. Right, my boss just goes ahead and moseys on out of there, and it's 3:30 in the morning, and I'm like, where are you going now? Like, um, I don't know the logistics of what you're about to do, but I assume like if you're taking the train back home, you're probably gonna get home around 5 a.m. And I'm sure your family's gonna be wondering, kind of what you're doing, whatever, or I mean, whatever. It's all good. He can be out. The point of this was, I kind of like had a lot of experiences like that in the financial world where I would have like an older guy or like a person who's tenured in the firm, like really want to hang out with us or want to hang out with a younger crowd and just be drinking late into the night, right? And that was kind of my um, uh, a few red flags, right? And I went ahead and just said, you know what, dude, like that's interesting and all, but I gotta mosey on out because this is not really my vibe, right? Like there's a lot of people you'll see in that corporate finance world that are like borderline alcoholics. They live for the happy hours and things like that. And to me, it was just kind of sad to see that. But he was a cool guy. I'm sure he's well and things like that. And no judgment passed. Just not necessarily the lifestyle or the vibe I'm trying to put off, right? So yeah, just an interesting story there, right? I think a couple points that come out of that is like, when you're open to new experiences, right? You're gonna have some funny stories to share. But you'll also learn a lot about people and the different kinds of people that are out there. So anyway, um, coming back to the book today, we got a new one for today. And so we hopped off of Mindful Relationship Habits, which is a book I really enjoyed. And today we're going to be going through a series that I've been reading. And this particular book is called The Crime Book by Big Ideas Simply Explained. Now, I don't know who the exact author of it is. I'm sure it's a conglomerate of people, but the overarching umbrella is called Big Ideas Simply Explained. And this one is called The Crime Book. So there's different partitions throughout the book, right? And it kind of shows the history of crime and how it evolved. So we'll go through it in like probably those three parts. Um, so um, there's something very interesting about this book. Okay, so there's different types of criminals, and like I said, they evolved through the ages. Okay, so the different categories are bandits, robbers, arsonists, um, con artists, white collar crimes, organized crimes, kidnapping and extortion, murder cases, and then serial killers and assassinations related to political plots. So, a few different categories. And I'm just going to go through a couple stories, but we'll go through each category podcast by podcast, right? So, today we're going to go through bandits, robbers, and arsonists. And not trying to go too deep into the level set, but you'll see how crime evolves, right? As societies become more civilized and the population increases, the police force has had to catch up, right? Or criminal investigation has had to catch up to that. And I've got a brand new perspective on crime, right? And you think that crime is just like one off, and it has to do with quote unquote bad people, and it doesn't really affect you, right, personally. But crime is a reaction to economics and economic circumstances, right? Like, for example, when there's a lot of oppression or poverty, people are going to act out. They're going to find different ways to make their ends meet or get out of their social standing. So, you know, I'm not going to harp on that any longer. Let's just go ahead and jump into the first story I have for today. So, the material is going to be a little bit different, a little bit more dense. So feel free to leave me any comments on how I can make this a little bit more interesting. But anyway, so the first crime we're going to go into is related to Edward Blackbeard Teach, and it takes place between 1716 and 1718, and it's all about like piracy, right, and racketeering and things like that. Excuse me. So the location of it, we're going to be talking about areas mainly in the Caribbean and the east coast of North America. So a little background on Edward Teach. So he was what they called a privateer during Queen Anne's War. I'll talk about what that is, right? So during Queen Anne's War, Edward Teach, Blackbeard, was a privateer. So after a short while, privateering became illegal, right? So we see this a lot with, veterans and people who come back from war, is that they often turn to a life of criminality, right, or a life of crime. So Blackbeard turned to piracy after the war, not being able to mesh into normal society. Okay, so that's a theme we'll see throughout. And then around 1716, Blackbeard went ahead and traveled to Nassau. And so I've personally been to Nassau. I've been on a cruise that docked in Nassau, and it's a great little island, right? It's you can tell it's a port city, has all the kind of like I don't know if it's French architecture from when they settled there. It's a very tropical place. I remember me and my buddies had a few drinks at like a tequila spot in Nassau and kind of walked around the island. It was really fun. Looks a lot like Pirates of the Caribbean. So, in 1716, Blackbeard traveled to Nassau, and then there he met Captain Benjamin Hornigold, and together they really plundered the waters around Cuba, Bermuda, and the east coast of America. So those two guys, Blackbeard and Hornigold, met another guy named Stede Bonnet, and they all joined forces there. Now, King George the First passed the Indemnity Act at this time. And what that did was pardon any pirate who went ahead and renounced his lifestyle and would not engage in piracy any further. So Hornigold, right, one of those three guys, actually took advantage of that and he parted ways with Blackbeard at that time. Okay, so he's out of the picture. So at the same time, some of Stede Bonnet's men actually left him and became loyal to Blackbeard. And then Blackbeard didn't kill Bonnet, but kept him on as like a quote unquote guest on his ship. So after that point, Blackbeard goes ahead, sets out to North Carolina, and he takes over the port of Charleston. So, what that entailed was he captured like 9 or 10 ships, and he held ransom a wealthy politician and a merchant. So, um, as Blackbeard and his fleet um, left North Carolina, um, their boats ran aground, right? And Blackbeard was actually captured, but he was granted a pardon by the governor of North Carolina, and so was Bonnet, even though he was kind of a guest on the ship. So Bonnet went ahead and stayed in North Carolina, but Blackbeard escaped and went back into his life of piracy, and stole his ships back, and they took off. Okay, so now Blackbeard had violated his terms and had a bounty on his head. So at this point, Lieutenant Robert Maynard caught up to Blackbeard, right? He was part of the Navy. And so his naval team, they actually found Blackbeard's fleet. And then Blackbeard ultimately outmaneuvered the naval fleet, right? And the naval fleet was lured onto a sandbar and they got stuck there, right? So at this point, Blackbeard could have just ran away, right? I'm like, all right, these guys are stuck. I'm good. I'm in the clear. But he turned around, right? He turned around and fired his cannons at the boat. So Blackbeard then, right? He goes ahead and tells his men to board the ship. So the men board the ship, and at that point, a bunch of naval officers, 30 to 40 naval officers, came from beneath the deck and Maynard, the captain, actually shot Blackbeard in the abs. So um, at this point, Blackbeard was really outnumbered. He was outgunned, but he didn't stop fighting, right? He continued to fight. It was clear he was going to fight to the death at this point. So he was actually shot 5 times and had over 20 sword wounds in him. Um, so, kind of a sad ending there. But Maynard actually went a step further, which is even more sad, a little bit more graphic. Um, they hung Blackbeard's head from the bow of their ship, and then later it was mounted on a stake as a warning to future pirates, right? And that's pretty gross. And we see that in a lot of movies, but it's based on fact, actually. So those are the facts, right? That's the story. And let's pause just for a minute to talk about why something like piracy would arise. Um, so Going back to the 13th century, King Henry III of England allowed something called privateering, like we talked about earlier. He allowed privateering commissions, and what they were groups of sailors that were allowed to plunder and attack foreign vessels in the name of the king. So British privateers would regularly attack French and Spanish ships. So once things had settled down though between the French, the Spanish, and the British, the privateers found themselves kind of on the wrong side of the law because privateering became illegal. Now, this is interesting because a lot of men who had these probably how do I put it? They had very wealthy upbringings, or they had, let's say, they even had poor upbringings, right? They were able to receive significant sums by plundering, by pillaging, by privateering, quote unquote, right? So now all of their hard-earned money is now illegal because, the king said so, right? And this brings up conversations of law, right? And we talk about law supposedly being developed in ethics, right? Rooted in ethics. But that's not always the case, right? We here in this specific example, we see it being allowed to plunder, right, and pillage, but after a short time, it was really made illegal. So, the lesson I take away from that is that, what really constitutes a criminal is not necessarily an ethics argument. It's more based on social structures that shift constantly, and it's derived from economic and political situations, as opposed to right and wrong, right? So, won't dive too deep into that, but it's an interesting conversation. So that was Blackbeard. And so we'll wrap that one up and we'll move on to the next story. So the next story we'll talk about is Bonnie and Clyde, and they came to prominence in the 1930s, which was the Great Depression era. So we're talking about outlaws here, right? They primarily operated in the Midwest, United States, and the story starts like this. And the book starts off with this story. So in 1933, two police cars pull up to an apartment in Missouri. The police officers yell for Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, part of the Barrow gang, to come out. Okay? So Clyde grabs his M1918 automatic rifle and he fires it through the window while Bonnie is laying down cover fire for him. They kill two officers and they escape. Now, the police go into the apartment. They find a bunch of weapons. They find handwritten poems from Bonnie, and some undeveloped film. So this film really romanticized the couple, but it also gave the police force a lot of information on the couple, and ultimately led to their downfall. And that's a theme throughout Bonnie and Clyde's like little escapade. Uh, they were glamorized in the media, right? But they would often escape just barely, and they experienced a lot of injuries, and their robberies were very, very sloppy. So let's talk about the time period, right? So 1931 through 1935, give or take a year here and there, was the period known as that public enemies period, right? And with like John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson robbing banks, right, in the Midwest. Um, it was a time where there was high profile criminals that really arose from the Great Depression. Okay, um, these criminals were really seen as like Robin Hood types, and they were at first supported by the general population. Okay, so I recently watched the movies Public Enemies again, right, and that's the story where Johnny Depp plays John Dillinger. And so in the story, John Dillinger did not want to kill people. He was totally against killing innocent people. And he didn't want to lose the support of the people. That's just not something he did, was harm innocent people. Um, he always says we're here for the bank's money, right? Insured by the federal government. We're not here for your money. You would see John Dillinger and his squad in fancy restaurants, really not worrying about being conspicuous, right? Wearing nice clothes, things like that. Um, and another thing to note as background knowledge was that um, the FBI was still in its early development phase, right? and they couldn't pursue criminals across state borders. So that really played to Bonnie and Clyde's advantage. So, history on the time period, right? So let's do a quick history on Bonnie and Clyde. So Bonnie and Clyde met in 1930, and they immediately hit it off. And then shortly after they met, Clyde was sent to prison for robbery, and he committed his first murder in prison, and where he beat an inmate to death with a lead pipe. Um, After that, Bonnie snuck in a gun, and Clyde escaped. So when Clyde got out of prison, it seems that he was like pissed about his jail time, and he wanted to take some sort of revenge on the prison system. And he started recruiting, other bandits associates, and they would rob gas stations, and kidnap and kill if they had to. So, um, from the story, it seems like they really had no sense of being, conspicuous or treading lightly. Okay, so um, when Clyde's brother was once released from jail, and Clyde recruited his brother and his brother's wife for the gang, um, when they were released from prison, they had a 12-day bender with drugs and alcohol that attracted the cops, right? And that's the story I talked about in the beginning of going through Bonnie and Clyde. They were just in their apartment, drinking, doing drugs, playing loud music for 12 days, and ultimately they called the cops on them. So after that, right, they start moving all over the Midwest from like Minnesota to Texas, Indiana, and they would commit all these crimes near state lines so that the FBI really couldn't pursue them. Um, and then after that, they started getting more violent, right? So as they got more violent, the public opinion changed of them. Uh, they used to apply like these type of heroic profiles to people. Um, and it was really a result of the economy, right? Uh, and by 1933, though, the gang started to experience some like inner turmoil. Okay, so there's a point where Clyde flipped a car that he was driving with Bonnie in it, and Bonnie suffered some serious injuries to her leg, like had some third-degree burns, and she was unable to really walk after that. So Clyde's often seen carrying her in pictures because she couldn't really walk after that incident. Also, Clyde's brother was shot in the head twice, I think. Once he recovered, the second time he didn't. Um, and he died in the hospital, but not before agents questioned him. So after that, they were really wreaking havoc on that Midwest and the country and setting a bad precedent. So um, Captain Frank A. Hammer was assigned to the case, and he was mentioned in the movie Highwaymen, where Kevin Costner plays Hammer, I think. So he put together a team, and they had a huge manhunt for Bonnie and Clyde. So, sure enough, Hammer got a tip, um, and of where Bonnie and Clyde would be. So they set up an ambush on a road in Louisiana, and there a bunch of officers hid in bushes. So Bonnie and Clyde's car pulls up. They jump out of the bushes and fire 130 rounds into the car, and Bonnie and Clyde suffered multiple fatal shots. Okay, and after that, which is really controversial, they towed the car into town and they towed it through town. And people were coming all around the car. They were trying to grab things off of Bonnie and Clyde. One guy tried to cut his finger off, his trigger finger off, Clyde's trigger finger, so they could keep it and maybe sell it later. I don't know, weird. Um, and there's a lot of controversy around that because they towed a dead couple with a bunch of shots in the car through the town, but also they didn't really give an attempt for them to surrender, right? So, it's a lesson learned, I guess. But in the end, um, the public enemies era really was done after about 1934, 1935, and a law was passed that made kidnapping and robbery a federal offense. So FBI could pursue across state lines. So, wrapping up this story, why did these celebrity criminals arise? So one thing that you'll notice is that the public was angry, right? They were faced with unemployment and then poverty associated with that. Um, so they essentially saw that like this rebellious nature towards the established order was somewhat heroic until it got violent, right? Going against that established order was very nice until it kind of hit home for the citizens. So like I said, like I was talking about in the level set, crime is really a reaction to economic policy and political policy. And I don't know too much about either of those things, but I'm gaining more knowledge on that as I'm reading. So very, very interesting points there. So, we're halfway through. We're going to go through two more stories. And the next one is called The Great Train Robbery, which occurred on August 8th, 1963. So it took place in Buckinghamshire, United Kingdom. So just a level set on the time, right? So life was very, very heavily poverty stricken. A lot of post-war situations were still going on from World War II, and were still present in the UK, right? We know a lot of veterans come back, have a hard time meshing in everyday society, and also there was that working class order, right? And it was hard to jump social strata. When you were in that industrial age England, and we might be past it at this point, but still some present themes there. So, like I said, when life is poverty stricken, some people are going to accept it, and some people are going to find ways to make ends meet or jump out of their class. So, let's talk about a guy named Ronald Edwards. So, Ronald Edwards worked in a sausage factory, and he would often start his life of crime through taking some of the meat home and selling it, probably at a discount or selling it at a lower price, black market meat, right? And like to me, this is a really weird side gig. Like someone probably knew him as like the sausage guy, right? Like that's my sausage hookup right there. Super weird, right? I definitely would not want to be known as the sausage guy, I guess. But anyway, side note. So, um, after this, right, he's successful with being the sausage guy. So then he moves on to bigger crimes, as we normally see. So he meets a guy named Gordon Goody. So um, he starts to move on to higher scale crimes with Gordon Goody. Um, and through their escapades and their expeditions, and having to and been jailed a couple times for crimes, they came into contact with a law clerk named Brian Field. So Field would give the details of the firm's, wealthier clients to Ronald Edwards and Gordon Goody, and that would be their next target. And Brian Field will get a percentage of those takings. So through all this, they met another guy, an Ulsterman, right, from Belfast, the Ulster Volunteer Force, little Peaky Blinders there. They met a guy named Patrick McKenna. So McKenna was a corrupt postal worker, and they let the group know that there were large sums of cash being carried on overnight mail trains from Glasgow to London, so from Scotland to England. So at that point, Goody and Edwards, they were not equipped to rob a train, right? So they took this information to a more experienced criminal in South London named Bruce Reynolds. So Reynolds developed a plan. They were going to stop this train at Buckinghamshire station, or a junction where they could interfere with the signal. They would stop the train, but they realized that they couldn't unload the money there. So they were going to move the train to a nearby bridge so they could offload it, forming a human chain into their vans and cars and take off. So they found out that all the high value packages were in the second car from the front. Um, So Reynolds really didn't want to leave anything to chance, so he spent a lot of time studying locomotives and manuals related to them. He recruited a train driver for the robbery, and he even acted like a school teacher and convinced a real train conductor to show him the basics. So lastly, they purchased a farm near the robbery where they could hide out at, after the robbery. So the day comes of the robbery, and the train was carrying about 2.6 million pounds, which is equivalent to $68 million today. So the robbers went ahead and boarded the train, and they knocked out the conductors and some of the related workers. So, how I said that they hired a replacement driver for this job. That driver soon realized that they were dealing with a state-of-the-art locomotive, right? A new one of its kind, and they had been practicing on older engines. So, which is super bogus, right? They ended up having to revive the guy they knocked out, You know, it's like, oh, dude, I'm about to rob you, knock you out. Just kidding. I need you to help me rob you. You know, that's super bogus, right? Anyway, so ultimately the gang steals the money, right? The gang steals the money, and they head back to the farm so they can hide out. Um, so a side note is that there appeared to be up to 17 men involved at one point um, in this robbery. So you can imagine that at some point someone's going to slip up. Okay, they had to be cautious not to spend too much money and raise any red flags. So they go to the farm, right? They're hiding out, and a neighbor reported some suspicious activity. So the cops show up, and no one's there. They leave. So they found fingerprints on a Monopoly game where they used the money from the robbery instead of fake money, and they found fingerprints on a ketchup bottle. Super annoying, right? Um, so within a few days, almost all of the members were jailed for 30 years. They were caught and jailed, and 30 years is really aggressive for a robbery. So a few of them escaped, but many of them died prematurely from, heart attacks and PTSD related things. But, like we saw with the previous two stories, they were romanticized, right? Because rebelling against your social class, and rebelling against the government and poverty was uh, was seen as heroic at the time. So um, it was seen as, like I said, vogue to show disobedience to the old school authority. And many of these people who stayed alive were released after 10, 15 years on grounds of compassion. Um, and something about the time period is that it was a time where laws were still being formed. Technology wasn't really as sophisticated, and there was a lot of poor people in the UK, right? So, like I said, people are going to find loopholes around the system in order to break away from their hard situations, right? So, like I said, if the government, the country is not helping the people, they're going to find a way to help themselves. So we see those similar themes coming through. So that takes us through the Great Train Robbery in 1963 in Buckinghamshire. And then we're on to our last story for the day, which is the story of Fulan Devi. And this story takes place in India. And it's a really interesting story from about 1979 to 1983, even through the 2000s. So the location is Uttar Pradesh, India. So Fulan Devi, she grew up poor in a low caste. And for those of you that don't know, the caste system doesn't mean as much now, but it meant a lot. It was everything back in the day. And this was in the 1980s, so not too long ago. So she was forced to marry a man 3 times her age, which is also not uncommon, right? In India, many girls are married to guys twice, 3 times their age. So she fled an abusive husband, and then she was disowned by her parents, which is crazy, right? Like it kind of attests to the difference in like what's socially acceptable, right? When her fleeing an abusive husband was was frowned upon, but for a different reason, right? Not because he was abusive, but because she left, which to me is kind of backwards. But anyway, just a victim of the time, right? So at 16, she became a bandit for a local gang, right? No husband, abandoned by her parents, joins a gang, and she starts raiding, highway robberies, and attacking upper caste villages, and also kidnapping rich people for ransom. In one instance, they went ahead and looted an entire town, and they distributed all of the goods, all the takings to the poor. So, like I said, um, this Robin Hood theme carried through, right? So Fulan Devi was a low caste member, like I said, and then she became a teenage gang member. But the main part of the story takes place when she was kidnapped by a high caste gang in Bemai. She was kidnapped and locked up for 3 weeks and repeatedly raped by different people. So after 3 weeks, she escapes. She gets back with her gang, and they return to that village um, where she had been captive. So in that village, they round up about 22 to 25 people, males, including a couple of her rapists, and they shot them all dead in the town square. And that was known as the Bimai Massacre. And at the time, it was India's largest mass execution. And then obviously a manhunt for Fulan Devi followed. So, like I said, she became somewhat of a Robin Hood figure. and her crimes were really glorified, um, and received as a rebuttal to the oppression of women in rural India, right? And something that still carries through today. So Fulan Devi ran for 2 years. She was a bandit. She was a criminal, and the police force was after her for 2 years. And she hid in villages of people that she would distribute her profits to, right? And they hit her. But after a couple years, she negotiated a surrender of her and her associates in return for reduced sentences. Now, she spent 11 years just waiting for trial. And then in 1994, all of her charges were dropped, which is really bogus, right? You're just sitting in jail for 11 years. And it just goes to show the judicial system in India is still catching up. But after she was released, she went into politics and she actually became an elected member of parliament. Um, but in 2001, she was assassinated. So that kind of ends her story right there. But we'll leave off today with the question of crime and candidacy, right? So a lot of people believe that, people who are convicted of crimes shouldn't be allowed to run for office because it contradicts the uh, the duties of a citizen, right, to not commit the crime in the first place. But a lot of voters will perceive a crime that is more for the public good to be more favorable, right? Like we talk about, I don't know if it's a perfect example, Pablo Escobar, right? He grew up poor, attained his glory through drugs and killing and stuff like that, and then he ran for office and thought he was the voice of the people, right? So we see these Robin Hood types coming to light through crime, right? And it seems that the public takes it well until um, innocent people start getting killed or people not associated with the conflict get killed. So an interesting little dialogue here. So like I said, a very different flavor of book today, but I'm enjoying the history of it. Definitely giving me a new view on crime and some of the reasons behind it. But I hope you guys are enjoying these podcasts. I hope you find them informative. Feel free to leave me any feedback, and remember, only positivity. Thanks, guys.